All right, everybody, welcome back to the podcast, Philosophy for the People. Today, we are joined with a new guest, joined with Jack Boczar. And Jack and I became acquainted a couple months ago, just mutual friend, connected us, said, hey, Jack's doing some cool work in metaphysics and philosophy. Think you might dig it. Sent me some of that work. In fact, I did dig it. I said we should talk about some of it on a podcast sometime. And now is that sometime. So welcome to the show, Jack. Good to have you here.
Awesome. Glad to be here. So, I guess we'll discuss some Thomistic metaphysics, existential inertia, the heavy topics today. I wanted to, just before I introduce the paper, I wanted to ask you a quick question first. So,
Yeah.
I was thinking about this last night, and I don't have a clear answer, but what do you think about the Christian and existential inertia? Namely, does the Christian have to hold to the divine conservation thesis? Do you think any biblical text, necessitate holding this? And the reason I ask is because Aquinas, in a lot of his commentary, in his commentary on John, and then in the Summa and in the Disputed Questions on Power, which we'll get into, he seems to think that the Bible almost necessitates the Christian holding that God conserves or preserves all things in being. But I mean, I don't know. I don't have a clear answer.
Yeah, I don't think I've spent much time thinking about that, to be honest. But just for people who aren't sure what the heck we're talking about, because we kind of just dove right into the deep end here.
Yeah.
Right? There's different positions on not just God, obviously, but God's relation to the world. And for a lot of classical theists, and I think this is true for both Jack and myself, we find ourselves persuaded towards the position that God doesn't just bring the world about, but he sustains it in being, for however long it is about. I think that it's best to think about, God is God makes it to be the case that, right? Using like external causal operators. And so, apart from God sustaining causal activity, nothing else apart from God would exist. And there's different, but even within that position, it is, also important, I think, to affirm that there's a real network of secondary causes, right? We're not occasionalists, right? When God makes it to be the case that Socrates, punches somebody, that can only be true if Socrates punches somebody, right? There's a real secondary cause there, right? So I think that's right. But then there's other positions that thinks that no, God can just sort of bring something about and then it can kind of carry on, on its own steam, right? These inertialist positions. So I think, sorry, I'm just kind of explaining the table of options here for people. But so I think philosophically is why I'm, pushed towards the traditional, God conserves things position. But I really have not spent a lot of time thinking, okay, is there like deep biblical warrant or Christian warrants? I know I don't even want to speak on that because I'm just not. I'll just probably just make myself look ignorant. I'm not an exegete by any stretch of the imagination, right? Yeah.
Well,
but it is an important question, right? Yeah, the Bible's hard, man. Bible's hard. I'm sure I could throw out a verse or two here, and then somebody like, well, hold on, I got a couple over here. I'm not falling for it, right? Yeah, no, it's a good thing. I'm certainly welcome comments from the audience on that. But it's just, so cool, man. All right, so getting into this, then I guess we kind of already sort of started. Lay out the question, the problem here, Jack, as you understand it, and then maybe we can start to think through this matter and its consequences and everything that comes out of it.
Yeah, so about a year ago, I wrote this paper for this seminar I was taking, and it was a seminar on the disputed questions on power and Aquinas's On Separate Substances, which are some later works. And a professor at the Dominican House told me that one of his graduate advisors told him that to really grasp Aquinas's metaphysics, you got to go to these lesser known texts, because the Summa, and you can see this in the prologue especially, really is an introductory work. It's meant for beginners. It was written probably for the brothers at Paris. And so there he's in the Summa, he's kind of laying out his whole system of theology. It's got a very organized structure to it, which is a whole nother complicated topic. Father Cajetan Cuddy at the Dominican House wrote his doctoral thesis just on the structure of the Summa.
Mhm.
But to grasp Aquinas's metaphysics, you got to go to these later texts, especially, like I mentioned, the questions on power and the separate substances treatise. And so I was reading through these, and I was shocked to discover that Aquinas has a really, really unique doctrine of creation. It seems to me, based on the literature that I know, that it was pretty much unique among his contemporaries. And Tim Noon at CUA has a great article on this called something like Aquinas's The Novelty of Aquinas' Doctrine of Creation. It's something like that. Basically, in that article, he argues that Aquinas's doctrine of creation was pretty much unheard of at the time, and Aquinas goes against Bonaventure. He goes against the Averroists like Caesar of Brabant, Boethius of Dasha, and then all these later thinkers at Cambridge, or in England, Cambridge, Oxford, and at Paris. They all differ from Aquinas slightly. So that's a great article. So anyway, I was reading through his treatment of creation in these texts, and I came across a couple of very fascinating passages. So the first one was from, I think, chapter 8 of the Separate Substances, where Aquinas says that creation can be proven. He's talking about a demonstrative position here.
Right. Mhm.
And he says something along the lines of, it's necessarily the case through syllogism, something like that. And then I confirmed this with a nice line from the sentences,
Mhm.
two sentences, distinction to question 1, article 2, where he says, not only does faith hold that there is creation, but reason almost also demonstrates it.
Mhm.
And so this kind of struck me, and I started thinking a lot more about this. And then when I got to reading the questions on power, he makes very similar moves. And then I realized that, well, okay, this whole notion of creation is directly related to this existential inertia problem. And I had always been really troubled by existential inertia from the time the literature started appearing, more vigorously about 5, 6 years ago with
Mhm.
Audi's papers, obviously Joe Schmid's papers and book. And I never really came across any places in Aquinas where he treats it. And so it was really interesting to think that, well, this problem of creation could be intricately or intimately connected.
Mhm.
Then I came across question 5 of the questions on power, where Aquinas flat out treats existential inertia, and he's setting up this inertiaist position almost exactly like it's set up today in the contemporary lit.
Mhm.
And I was shocked because I had never seen anybody discussing this in the Thomistic literature before.
Yeah, which
And
is
so, yeah.
yeah, finish your thought, I'll chime in. Yeah, go ahead.
No,
Mhm.
no, no, and from the Thomistic point of view, there's really only one paper, that would be Kerr's 2022 or 2023 paper.
There's no
Um,
Vetera one, I think.
yeah, yeah, it's
Yeah.
in his collected articles, but that's really the only paper. You got Phasers, but he's not doing an exegetical route. He's trying to make in his existential inertia in the 5 ways paper, he's trying to argue that the 5 ways are like undercutter defeaters or something. But really, like diving into Thomas's text, there's almost no literature on it. So I
Yeah.
was shocked.
Yeah, that is interesting, and just, historically, I first encountered existential inertia from Adler. For
Yep.
people who know me, Adler's book, How to Think About God, was one of the first books on natural theology I ever read a very, very long time ago. And I guess it's kind of interesting because, Adler always prided himself on reading so much Aquinas, right?
Mhm,
So
mhm,
I guess he just must have missed that. But right, so he sort of presents it in his book, How to Think About God, as reason for thinking that Aquinas's traditional, philosophical approaches to God are undermined by this
mhm,
inertialist proposal. And then he
mhm,
gives sort of just a kind of a broad contingency argument, right? Thinking that you can move from a notion of like modal contingency to things being dependently contingent, which I actually think is in a sense more problematic. Like you should have
mhm,
just went back to Aquinas's and made and
mhm,
shown why his metaphysics is incompatible with existential inertia. Because what I think Adler doesn't do is he doesn't justify something like a PSR that can close the gap
yeah,
between a modal contingency. He just sort of assumes it. He just assumes that since the universe could have been otherwise or failed to exist, it must be dependent or caused, right? And that's that
mhm,
itself, I think is a mistake, or at least it's certainly too quick, right? You need some sort of principle to make that leap, which he doesn't develop. So I don't even think his own project, which he's saying is sort of a way to move forward from Aquinas's, is ultimately successful. At least, well, I don't want to say it's not, because I think you can I think you can defend such a principle, but he just doesn't do it, right? But it is interesting. I'm just noting that it's interesting that even Adler would have missed this, because if you've read a bunch of Adler, he's so big into reading Aquinas, but hey, we don't all catch everything, do we? Right?
Yeah. No, I mean, it's just not talked about. And so the goal of this paper that I ended up writing was to just take one piece of Aquinas's argumentation, and I'm just going to provide kind of a argument, basically how Aquinas would respond to this existential inertia charge. And all I wanted to do was do a closer reading of a small text from the Questions on Power and the sentences, and then really dive into, here's the argument, here are 3 objections. So before we get into that, let me just, for the audience, I guess, lay out the sort of basic thrust of the issue. I mean, you kind of did already, but if you
real quick, Jack, this paper was in New Blackfriars, right?
Yeah, this is New Blackfriars. It's first view right now, but it's coming out, I think, in the next edition. So
okay, cool. Just want to make, I'll link the stuff below if people want to read it. Yeah, cool. All right,
let me quick silence my phone here. My dad was giving me a call.
That's funny. I already got a spam call. People heard the ringing there. How dare you? How dare you?
Exactly.
Good. Yeah. It's all right. We're all good, man. We keep things pretty chill around here.
Exactly. So I think the best way to go about this, if you want to look strictly at Aquinas' text, is to go to his Questions on Power, question 5, article 1, and read through the objections. And the basic idea here is that he's, in question 5, he's looking at God's power. And so there's a lot of good lit on the structure of the De Potentia, but question 5 in particular, he's looking at God's power and how it acts to preserve things or annihilate things. And so the first article here in question 5 is whether things are preserved in their being by God, or if all God's action were circumscribed, they would remain in being. And then in article 2, he develops that a little bit more. So if you read through the objections, I think you get a pretty good sense of what's going on here. And in my paper, which I have right here, I focus specifically on, let's see here, objection 4. So that's the one I focus on quite a bit. And I'll basically just read it out. It's pretty short, but it says, God, this is the objector speaking, God is the cause of things as an efficient cause. Now the effect remains when the action of the efficient cause ceases. For example, the builder ceases to act, yet the house remains. The flame that caused the fire may cease to burn, yet the fire caused by it continues. Therefore, even if God's actions cease altogether, creatures can continue to exist. And I think this encapsulates the inertialist position pretty well. And like I said, it's awesome to hear that Aquinas was thinking about this in his own day. But the basic idea is just that when you have an efficient cause for now, we can roughly define as something that some agent or action that brings something else into being or existence. Now, that's going to come up in a bit when we discuss Aquinas and Avicenna's distinctions there. But the basic idea is that once you have something, you create something, make something, even if the agent that created it ceases to be, that thing will still remain. And so the classic example is the house. The builder can die and the house is going to remain. And so in the same idea, God can create the world and God can stop acting and the world's just going to continue on in being. It has this existential inertia. And it's a kind of an analog to the idea of inertia in physics, where something in motion will remain in motion. Same idea here with existence. Once something's in existence, it's going to continue, barring any other destructive factors, we could say. And this would be like the deist position, I guess, seems to me, where you have the classic kind of 16th, 17th, 18th century notions of God just makes the world and then stops acting, and he kind of winds it up like a clock almost, and it's an independent entity.
Yeah, flicks that first domino, whatever analogy you want to use, right?
Exactly. And so if you look actually at the contemporary literature, so I pretty much reference Schmidt and Lindorf's book here. They pretty much define it in an almost identical way. And in my Schmidt says, and I quote this on page 1 of my article, in simplest terms, existential inertia is the claim that at least some temporal concrete objects persist in the absence of both sustenance or conservation form without and two sufficiently destructive factors. You can go read it, and then he gives a more concrete definition later. But it's basically the same idea that things are just going to continue to persist without any destructive factors.
Right.
So that's the sort of setup. And the issue that I outline in the paper is that this can be used to undercut Thomistic natural theology. It can be used to undercut even further, which I'm not sure if Schmidt and Lindorf discussed this, but you can take this even further and undercut stuff like miracles, divine providence, grace. That's a huge one for those Thomists who are listening in. Physical premotion. If you're interested in the De Auxiliis controversy, this is the metaphysical principle, one of them operating in the background, because in order for God to move you, he has to be able to act on you and exercise providence. And this comes up in the Gentiles 364 and 95,
Right.
94 and 65, where Aquinas is talking about providence. And so I reference a footnote in my paper just discussing a little bit of that. I don't get into those details.
Yeah, but this makes sense, right?
Yeah,
Because
I think,
it really
Oppie
deals with.
also brings up in his paper.
I'm sorry, Jack. We had just a little bit of lag and crossover there. I was just saying that it makes sense that it has a lot of these consequences because it's really dealing fundamentally with God's relation to the world, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So continue. Yep.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. So, to summarize there, existential inertia is just a. Can you hear me? Are we good?
Yes.
We good now?
We got a little choppiness. I think we're all right now. Let's keep going. Test it out.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so just a quick summary there. It's the existential inertia is the position that things will persist, barring any destructive factors, and they don't need God's concerted action. And this has implications for natural theology, the arguments for God, and then theological notions like grace, etc. Yeah, so what I wanted to do then in the paper is set up, well, how does Aquinas respond to this? And the way that I do this is by looking precisely first at what the inertialist position is. And so I think that it's really important to get clear on the fact that, as we've just articulated it, the inertialist position is simply a descriptive thesis. And Schmid points this out in his book, which he does a very nice job there. And what do I mean by that? Well, basically, what I mean is that when you articulate the inertialist position, you're simply making an observation about how the world is. You haven't yet justified or provided the metaphysical backdrop for that position. And so, a rough analogy here would be like, I observe that this can is red, or I observe that this can is made out of aluminum. Just as you observe that things in the world seem to continue to persist without any factors like conservation or a destructive factor. And so what this means is that the inertialist and the conservationist like Thomas need to articulate a metaphysical backdrop to explain and justify their position.
Yeah. What makes it the case that
Exactly.
this observation occurs? That's right. Yeah.
Yes. And so I think once we then move from the definition of the position to looking at the underpinning metaphysics, we can then start to tease out, which one seems more likely. And so that's how I start the paper. And then I transition into the metaphysical kind of apparatus behind it. And so the basic idea is that if you're going to hold to an inertialist position, you need to deploy some sort of, atomistic metaphysics or four-dimensionalist metaphysics like Schmidt and Lindorf do. Whereas if you're going to defend the conservationist thesis, you're going to have to deploy something akin to a Thomistic metaphysics. Yeah, before I go on, any thoughts there?
No, I agree. I think that's the heart of the matter, and we'll get into
Mhm.
it. But right, as a descriptive thesis, there's not. I don't want to say it's uninteresting, but it's not immediately threatening, right?
Yes.
What's
Yes.
threatening is whether what makes it the case that these things seem to continue on existing unless something knocks them out of being
Mhm.
is God's action or not, right? Because
Yep.
God conserving things and being until they're knocked out would give you what's needed to make it seem like things conserve keep going and being until they're knocked out, right? So, and I think the heart of the matter really is this, right? Does the Thomistic metaphysical system have metaphysical space for existential inertia? If not, then it's not a threat if you
Mhm.
assume this system. Now,
Yes.
somebody might say, well, I don't like this system. I have a different system, and that has space for existential inertia. But then, I think it's important, then it isn't existential inertia that's undercutting the arguments for God. This is
Yes.
a
Yep.
deeper debate between metaphysical systems. I just want to kind of like frame it in the best, like, so people understand what's actually going on. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Yep, that's
Mhm.
exactly right. In fact, a lot of these arguments, boil down to the deeper metaphysical
I think
issues.
I'll just random. I think a lot of them do, right.
Mhm.
I guess there's a few arguments. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. Like, I guess there's a few arguments that maybe stand or fall by themselves, but those are arguments I'm sort of like, yeah, like Adler's argument, right? Is like, I guess a
Mhm.
little bit more metaphysically neutral, but then again, there's still stuff that he doesn't justify that I think he needed to justify, right?
Mhm.
Whereas, I like my metaphysics, right? So I'm happy to grant that a lot of the arguments that I advance, including my book and elsewhere, they do rely upon this sort of broadly Thomistic Aristotelian scheme, and I
Mhm.
think they're good arguments given that scheme. Now, I fully accept that not everybody's going to sign on for that,
Mhm.
but I also think that is a really great theory. I mean, I just haven't really seen a better metaphysic than what is provided in that sort of perennial tradition that's sort of, I think, highly refined and at its best when you get to Aquinas, if that makes
Yeah.
sense, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, just making those, I don't know, disclaimers or what have you. So back to you, sir.
Yeah, and then I guess for people who are interested in that, I mean, I think you're a fan of Gerson's book, Platonism and Naturalism,
Yeah, I think
Possibility
it's
of Philosophy.
brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah, I would suggest that people read that and then, MacIntyre's preface to the 3rd edition of After Virtue,
Hmm.
because I think those are really the best treatments I've come across so far where people are discussing the sort of meta picture of metaphysical systems, and really asking the question of which system is gonna provide us with the best explanation of reality.
Right. And if you read Gerson, man, he really shifted my thought on Plato and Plotinus because it sounds
Yep.
so scholastic when you read, you know what I mean? Right.
Yeah.
He's
Yeah.
all the way with divine simplicity and all that stuff, right? But it's a brilliant work because what he's trying to show is a sort of connection between these different ideas and philosophical systems between atomism and nominalism and mechanism, and he's arguing like these
Mhm.
things are really a package deal, guys, right? We won't get into all this now. I just want to reiterate what
Mhm.
Jack says. I think it is an absolutely brilliant book that helps people kind of see the wider perspective that yes, these deeper level debates about which metaphysical theory is superior. Yeah, maybe that's where the action really is at the end of the day. And we're kind of just a lot of times talking past each other with specific arguments for the existence of God, precisely because we don't even have our metaphysics worked out, or we're just coming to the table with very different takes on much more fundamental issues, right?
Exactly. Yeah. No, that's exactly right. So yeah, um, let's get into the sort of Thomistic action here. Um, Let me say if people are more interested, I got a list of texts here, which is important. Like I said, De Potentia 5, 1 and 2, Summa, Prima Pars 104, 1, Gentiles 3:94 and 65, and then the two sentences, distinction 1, question 1, and then one sentence is question or distinction 37, question 1. And then actually he does mention it, which is worth looking at, and I can read this quote in a bit, in his John commentary, which is interesting.
Mm.
So a John commentary 5, that'll be paragraph 739. So if people are interested, I just want to get that out there. Please look at all of Aquinas's texts on this issue and sort of piece together his overall position, because I think, in my experience, a lot of secondary lit on Aquinas really only focuses on the Summa. They don't go to these other sources, which I think is
Yeah, I'm with you.
problematic.
Hmm.
Yeah. So, yeah, with that in mind, let me read this quote from the John commentary, because this is going to be the thrust of Aquinas's response. So, like I said, this is the John commentary, chapter 5, lecture 2, and it's paragraph 739. But basically, he says here, the reason for this, namely that God is the continuous cause of all things, the reason for this is that things which depend on a cause only for their coming into existence are able to exist when that cause ceases, but things that depend on a cause not only for their coming into existence, but also to exist, need that cause for their continuous conservation in existence. Okay, so this is Aquinas's most simplified summary of his position. And the first thing he's doing there that we can notice is making a distinction within the efficient cause. And so I think it's important to note that historically, in the Middle Ages, when you have the advent of Aristotle's texts in the Arabic world and in the Latin West, you had massive, massive commentaries on the physics, the metaphysics. You had all sorts of debates within schools. And Aquinas here is inheriting from Avicenna a distinction between the efficient cause. And so, for those familiar with Aristotle, it seems pretty solid that it seems pretty sound, whatever you want to say, to me, that Aristotle didn't have a doctrine of creation. His notion of the efficient cause is pretty, it seems to me to be referring only to change, the actualization of a potency with regard to physics. And when Avicenna comes on the scene and writes his Al-Shifa and the metaphysics of the healing, the whole book is sort of a response, you could say, to Aristotle. And Avicenna he's more scattered than Aquinas, he's not as systematic, but definitely in book 6, chapters 1 through 3, and book 8, I want to say chapter 4, is pretty explicit that there's two types of efficient causes. There's an efficient cause of existence, and there's an efficient cause of change. And for the listeners out here, you might already subconsciously assume this and say, well, yeah, that's obvious, especially for Christians. But this was a hotly debated topic in the Middle Ages. And so Aquinas is inheriting this, and he says, well, you can think about an efficient cause like me moving this can, and I'm causing it to change. I'm actualizing the potency of it being to my left. But there's also the efficient cause of being or creating. So for Avicenna, God and secondary agents can create. For Aquinas, only God can create. He argues that in the De Potentia. But the basic idea there is that we have to make a distinction between these types of efficient causes. And I think once we do that, the argument starts to get off the ground. And then from there, Aquinas goes on and says, well, it's true that for an efficient cause of change, such as the builder, once the builder, builds the house, he can disappear, he can die, he can go elsewhere, and that house is going to continue on existing without any further action from him. But when it comes to an efficient cause of being, this is not the case. And we should unpack why, but that's the sort of starting intuition or kind of first sort of axiom that Aquinas is working with. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, no, great. I think it's a great start. Of course, I think it's only a start because we want to know, well, why is there this distinction, right? Because at this point, it seems
yes,
right. mere assertion, as they say, right? But I agree with you that the intuition seems to be there, right? Because it just seems totally legitimate at first to just ask why something is still in existence even after it's brought about, right? That seems like a very intelligible question to ask. So let's get into that a little bit, right?
Yeah. So I will bring up my main argument here. So once we've got that down and we're thinking scholastically here with some distinctions,
Mhm.
Aquinas is going to go on and he's going to give his argument. And in my paper, I take pieces from the sentences and from the disputed questions on power, and I sort of reformulate in premise format what I think Aquinas would say.
Mhm.
And so the basic idea is that when you have some sort of object, so, a can, whatever, anything that is, any being, it is going to be composed of essence and existence. Essence and esse. I prefer esse because for various reasons. So essence and esse are the constituent principles of a thing. And so Aquinas recognizes that. And then he says, okay, well, if you have a thing, a being, and it's composed of essence and esse, well, those two principles are really distinct. But if they're really distinct, that leads to an interesting sort of paradox, namely that what a thing is, its essence, its nature, the whatness of a thing, is actually it's really distinct from the reality of its existence, the fact that it is, you could say. And from there, Aquinas argues that, okay, well, if this is the case, then at all times a thing is, it's going to need this esse principle to be. It has to be conjoined, and I've got some air quotes there because
Mhm.
it gets into. I don't want people to picture essence and esse as sort of like two Lego bricks that come together.
Right.
It's a
Yeah.
bit more
They're not.
complicated than that.
Yeah, they're
Yeah,
not things in and of themselves, right? They're constituent
exactly.
principles. They're, to use
Mhm.
Fregean language, they're incomplete entities, right? That require
Yes.
supplementation from their counterpart to actually form the composite whole and be, right? And they're inseparable, right?
Exactly.
Really
Yeah.
distinct,
And
but
so
inseparable. Those are different notions. People,
exactly.
yeah, so right. Distinctions upon distinctions
Yes.
upon distinctions. Gotta love scholastics for this stuff, right? But
Yes.
yeah,
And
no, I
if
want to
and if you're
emphasize what you're getting
wondering.
at. Yeah, just
Mhm.
real quick, I just want to emphasize that I think this is what it comes down to ultimately, right? Is Aquinas' thesis of the real distinction, his metaphysics of
Yep.
essence and esse, right? And if you
Mhm.
think that there's good reasons to hold to this real distinction thesis, I think that's what kind of takes out all the room for something like existential inertia.
Mhm.
But if you don't have this thesis, then I think you've got some you might have I don't know. I don't know what other routes might be available, but I think like this is really the sort of the what's going to do the theoretical work that people who want to push the traditional arguments for God through they need to have that. So I just want to emphasize sort of like how critical this piece is to the puzzle, right? Hmm.
Yes, no, I would totally agree here, and I would say that yes, this Aquinas's entire metaphysics and his Christology and his Trinitarian theology all rest upon the real distinction. You have to understand that. If we were talking about Christology, there's a whole debate over how the unity of the natures occurs in one person, namely Christ. He appeals to the real distinction in Trinitarian theology. This is how he gets his doctrine of relations. So yeah, totally. So then Aquinas's sort of idea is that, well, once you start asking, once you make that distinction between the essence and the essay, well, at all times a thing is, why is it at all? Well, that's because of its essay, that's actualizing it, that's responsible. It's the explanation for its existence at all times. But if it's really distinct from what the thing is, then at all times that essay and that essence have to be joined together. And Then he argues that, well, this has to occur because of God's action. And so his ultimate answer is that to explain any individual being, any being at all other than God, you have to appeal to God's action that is upholding or explaining the thing in terms of its distinction between essence and esse. And let me pull up my argument here. So basically, I formulate this in premise format, and I start with premise one. Composite things do not have esse in virtue of what they are. And so this would be what we were just talking about. This is justified by the real distinction.
Mhm.
So in his sentences, two sentences, distinction one, question one, article two, he says this explicitly, that composite things, not in this exact language, but he says things do not have esse in virtue of what they are, and that's going to be the real distinction. And then I go, well, if composite things do not have esse in virtue of what they are, then they must have it from another. This is a key move here, is if things do not have existence in virtue of what they are, they don't yet exist. And so they can't cause themselves. And so their existence, their esse, has to be from without, you could say. It has to be from another agent or something.
Mhm.
Then premise three would be a composite thing participates esse at all times. And this is going to be justified by Aquinas' account of participation, which is explicit in his De Hebdomad's commentary and elsewhere. And so all that means is that anytime a thing is, it has its esse, its act of existence, and that because that's the reason why it exists to begin with. And so anytime a thing's existing, it's participating esse. And then premise four, a composite thing must have esse from another at all times. This simply follows from premises two and three. If it cannot have another, or if it cannot have esse from anything but another and it has it at all times, then it has it in terms of another at all times. That's my sort of
Mhm.
summary of that premise. But only God can be the cause of esse, and this is reliant on his argumentation from earlier in the De Potentia. And so the conclusion that just follows naturally from this is that at all times a thing is existing, it has that esse from God, and we get the divine conservation and the refutation of the inertialist position right there.
Yeah, good. No, I think it is. I think it is a definitive response within this metaphysical system.
Mhm,
And I'm happy to grant that people can challenge different aspects of it, right? They can
mhm,
challenge the real distinction, and people
mhm.
do. But if you challenge the real distinction, it's not existential inertia that's doing the undercutting work at that point,
Yes.
right? So
Yeah.
what you're showing is no, according to the system, this is why there's no room for existential inertia to do the undercutting work. So if you want
Mhm.
to, take down, these traditional approaches to God, you got to kind of back up and examine some of these theoretical commitments that Aquinas has and consider challenging some of those, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's definitely right. I actually sent this paper before I sent it to Blackfriars to a pretty classical Thomist who studied with Owens and up at Toronto back in the 80s. And I said, "What do you make of this inertialist position?" And he responded, he's like, "I don't really know why you're writing this paper. It's never occurred to me, since we have the real distinction, that we ever need to discuss this, because it just follows from the fact that a thing doesn't have existence in virtue of what it is. It just follows from that it needs existence from some sort of external principle. And if you buy Aquinas' arguments that it can only be God, or if you buy Avicenna's arguments that it could be the agent intellect, the giver of forms, and the celestial spheres, then you have a refutation for the inertialist position right there. So you could criticize my premise five and say, well, this doesn't need to be God, and okay, that's fine. Like, we can admit that maybe Aquinas is wrong and maybe Avicenna's right, but that still gets you a refutation of the inertialist position, even if some sort of giver of forms is doing the work conserving things. That's a different debate. I'm just defending Aquinas's position here, and I'm taking for granted the fact that only God can give esse or create things.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think you're totally right to say that this argument depends pretty much entirely on the real distinction. And I should mention that, we really have to take the real distinction seriously, not only for the theological reasons I mentioned earlier, but because it also needs to be understood that after Aquinas's death in was it 1274, this real distinction thesis caused massive amounts of controversy at Paris. And you had Godfrey of Fontaine, Caesar of Brabant, James of Vitrebo, Henry of Ghent, Giles of Rome, all writing and arguing back and forth for years about what this is, what this entails, should we accept it or not. So I'm not going to say that you should just take it as axiomatic. I know I've met a few Thomists who do want to say that. I don't like that position. I think we should avoid that. I think we should look at Aquinas's explicit argumentation for the real
Right.
distinction
I'm with
and
you. Right.
defend it. Yeah, defend it as best we can. But once I think the main point here is that once you accept that, the inertialist position sort of falls away.
Yeah, and this is like, at least for people who are somewhat familiar with these philosophical circles, this isn't news, right? I think it's always been pretty well known that Aquinas's approach to God and a lot of his other ways of explaining important things depend upon the real distinction, right? Like it's clear, like this does enormous work for him, right? His metaphysics and of essence and esse. I mean, this is his pet, right? Now, I think it's true. I think it's right, and I think it actually does a ton of great theoretical work across just perennial philosophical issues. I mean, this is why I love recommending Norris Clarke's The One and the Many, because it just shows like how, even aside from direct arguments like the multiplicity argument, whatever, you have people like Norris Clarke who says, no, this is just a really fruitful theory, right?
Yes.
For just helping to make sense of a lot of those perennial, philosophical issues that people have been wrestling with for a long time. So I think you can kind of make a cumulative case, right, of just it being a very fruitful and virtuous, metaphysical theory in and of itself for other independent issues in favor of the real distinction as well. Again, different conversation, but it does need to be emphasized as, Aquinas depends on this a lot. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, no, let's discuss that in a sec here, because I was developing another objection a couple weeks ago that I didn't include in the paper. But yeah, just for quick summary for the audience, basically, if you go to my paper and you look at page 6, that's where the argument's laid out. And again, the basic idea is that once you admit that things there's a real distinction between essence and esse in things, you have to admit also that what a thing is. A thing does not have esse in virtue of its own nature, and so it has it from without, and the only thing that can cause that is God. So boom, since a thing exists at all times, it has esse at all times from God. Inertialist position is now undercut. So yeah, getting on that real distinction topic, Aquinas provides 5 arguments throughout his corpus. We won't get into those. Those get super, super technical, exegetical work, lots of scholarly controversy. That's a whole nother topic. But
people are interested. I've had multiple conversations with like Gavin Kerr and others on that, so they can kind of dig that stuff up if they want to. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. And Whipple's book, again, fantastic. Metaphysical Thought of Aquinas. He lists out all the texts. He gives summaries of each argument and the scholarly debates over them. So yeah, go to that. So after I lay out this argument in the paper, I basically go in and discuss a little bit more about this topic, and I offer 3 seemingly novel objections. And then I've got this 4th one that I was thinking about this summer. And so obviously you can go read the paper, but the basic thrust of all of these objections is going to be to question that real distinction somehow. And so one of
Mhm.
the ways you could do it is by saying that it commits an equivocation in the argument. So I point out how the argument seems to refer to essence one and essence two, denoting the equivocation there. And I respond to that. I don't think that that objection goes through.
Mhm.
But I think the more powerful objection here is the fact that essence and esse are sort of unintelligible in Aquinas's scheme. And so this would be in my paper, um, objection 3. And so the basic idea is that, or
Let me
it's
say
actually,
I appreciated these objections, Jack, because they were,
mhm.
I think, advancing the conversation in a way that I haven't really seen much before.
Good. Yeah, no, that's what I want to do. I want, like I said, I want to get more people thinking about the essence essay distinction and really articulating that. If you go to section or pages 9 through 12 of the paper, I really lay out this objection that they kind of seem to be unintelligible. And the reason for this is that the basic idea is that if you have essence, the essence of this can, we could say like it's aluminum. We can go through the whole scholastic method of defining what a thing is. It holds sparkling water, etc. Whatever it was, we can go through the four causes to really articulate what the essence is. But because esse is distinct from essence, you can't do that. And so it seems that it's basically just a not even a bare concept. It doesn't even rise to that level. That esse without essence is just unintelligible. You can't even articulate what it is. And if it's unintelligible, we could also level the further claim that, well, it should kind of just drop away in our ontology because, it doesn't, it's just unintelligible. We can't say anything about it. And the same, but in a different way, could be said about essence without esse. Namely, that, well, we can conceptually say what an essence is, but it's not real. And so we can't tangibly grasp it. And so it seems to me that without um, that if you make this distinction, you run into sort of unintelligibility problems here. Um, and I was thinking about this more, like I said, this summer, and I sort of developed this further. And I was thinking about Aristotle and how most Aristotelians, other than Owens, are going to admit that he doesn't have an essence essay distinction, nor does Averroes or his followers, the Latin Averroists. And this is one of the reasons why they don't think that a real distinction between essence and esse is doing any sort of metaphysical work in our sort of system. They think that we're basically just postulating a additional category or an additional concept that's unintelligible. It's sort of like an ad hoc postulation. And so Seizure, in his commentary on the metaphysics, question 7, he advances 10 or so arguments against the real distinction. And the thrust of a lot of them is that whatever a thing, whatever the reason for its existence, it's not really distinct from its esse. It's just part of its essence, or it's not really distinct from its essence. It's just part of its essence. And so essence there is doing all the heavy lifting. And by admitting that esse is part of the thing's essence, what we get is we actually get intelligibility. And so we can now define esse in terms of things essence because it's included in the thing's essence. So they're not really distinct, they're only conceptually distinct. And that is going to be, I think, one of the main responses. Yeah, any thoughts there?
Yeah, no, I think it's good. I just want to just for people, because again, we're kind of wading through some tall metaphysical grass here. The objection we're considering is towards the real distinction
Mhm.
thesis, right? Which, as we've argued, like, this is, if you want to get existential inertia to go through, this is probably the direction you should fire your attacks in, right?
Yeah.
But at
Yeah.
that
And
point,
so,
honestly, like, you don't, like, it's not even that. Like, if you can fire sufficient, artillery at the real distinction thesis, then if that's gone, Aquinas' arguments are gone anyways. You don't need you don't need existential inertia at that point, right?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I think that this is an interesting thought that I haven't written out, but even if you took out the real distinction, I think the inertialist would have to go further, because from the Aristotelian perspective, where you have a thing where you're collapsing a thing's esse into its essence, you still have the prime mover directing a thing at all times toward its final cause. And so you might not have the prime mover sustaining a thing in its existence as the Thomist articulates it, but you still have the prime mover sustaining a thing in terms of its final cause.
Sure.
And so the inertialist would have to then undercut that further claim, because without the final cause, then things would, I don't know if they'd go out of existence, but they pretty surely would, spiral out of control and start acting toward weird ends.
Yes, at least within that metaphysical system, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting point. That's good. Okay. Well, anyways, back to the objection. Let's get your thoughts and response to it. Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, I think the first response is to double down on Aquinas's own argumentation for the real distinction. And like I said, that's a whole different topic, but that would be like an undercutting defeater for the objection. And you could basically say, well, Aquinas's arguments for the real distinction are really solid. You're going to have to do more than just posit this sort of objection and say we can collapse the two. We can collapse esse into essence, because we have independent argumentation already for the real distinction. So that would be the sort of primary response. And then I think the secondary response would be to kind of double down on what you mentioned earlier, which would be the explanatory power of Aquinas's real distinction. And so just for the listeners, really the objection that I'm bringing up against the real distinction is motivated by the fact that esse and essence are sort of unintelligible if you have a real distinction. And I don't think that this objection goes through if you properly understand Aquinas's his position. So what do I mean by that? Well, the basic idea is that for Aquinas, he is looking to answer the deeper question of why anything is at all, especially contingent objects in front of us at all times. And for the person who is advancing this objection, it seems to me that they're going to have to rely on a deeper metaphysical claim of sort of bruteness. And so you get this in the Aristotelian system a lot. You don't have the notion of creation, like I mentioned earlier. Species are eternal. And so the reason why man is at all, in the Aristotelian system, there isn't really an answer. It always has been. And so eternality is sort of the ultimate explanation. Aquinas is going deeper and asking, well, why is the species of man at all? Why is the individual man at all? And if we think about it from this perspective, we can note that, well, actually in our ontology, the real distinction is providing something extremely fruitful, namely it's answering that question. For the Aristotelian, if you collapse esse into essence, you're going to have a really hard time answering that question. I think you're going to end up having to dismiss the question and just rely on the fact that things are eternal. Now, we can go further and say that, well, in our ontology, not only is the real distinction providing something fruitful to explain reality, but we can also make the real distinction intelligible by looking at Aquinas' theory of cognition, right? And so the Whipple does a great job in his chapter 0 or chapter 1 of his metaphysical thought. Gilson also does a great job in his Being and Some Philosophers in the appendices. And then you have Whipple's got a couple articles on the separation, the negative judgment of separation. This was a huge talk in the 20th century in Thomism. Right. But the basic idea is that, well, we don't need to define esse in terms of what it is, because that's not the way that cognition is working. When we recognize that a thing is, we can then go and define it in terms of its essence and look at it and make it intelligible. But we can also make intelligible esse without essence, because we first recognize that it is, and we make a sort of special judgment in our mind, and that judgment precedes defining it in terms of essence. And so once we get into the weeds on this, what we see is that the objection sort of starts to fall away, because it's relying on the assumption that the judgment of the judgment concerning the intelligibility of what a thing is equally applied to esse. But
Yeah.
in Aquinas' system, it's not. They're two separate acts of the intellect. And so it's sort of a false analogy to go from, well, we can define, the can sitting in front of me, so we have to be able to also define esse. And once we recognize that we're making distinct actions of the mind when we're looking at esse and essence, I think the objection sort of falls away. And now we've shifted the debate toward Aquinas' theory of cognition.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's absolutely right and great. And I love that you brought in his cognitional theory to help with that. So just to kind of summarize what I'm hearing here, Jack, one, challenge that it isn't theoretically fruitful by showing how it is, and that's where you can make that sort of cumulative
Yes.
case that we talked about before. Point back to his actual arguments for the real distinction and say it's not enough to just assert that you can collapse these things. We actually have, a handful of arguments here that seem to be pretty powerful. So you're going to need to work on those, and then undermine the intelligibility objection by looking deeper into Thomistic cognitional theory. Is that a good summary of your way of? Am I missing a point there? Sorry.
No. I think that's spot on. I
Mhm.
like how you brought up Norris Clark earlier, because him and Whipple again go to great lengths to show that in order to solve the problem of the one and the many, it seems like you have to appeal to a real distinction. And that was what I was trying to get at earlier,
Right. Hmm.
um, where you really have to think about, I think, why there is anything at all rather than nothing. And it seems to me that once you start going down that route, you have to admit something like a real distinction.
Right. And how things have some principle of similarity and some principle of different across different dimensions, vertical, horizontal. And once you really start thinking about that,
Yeah.
yeah, I think like the real distinction is super fruitful there. Right. Spot on. Hmm.
Yeah, and that's some of Aquinas's argumentation for the real distinction relies on this notion of solving the problem of the one and the many, because he's trying to articulate why things are different, even though they have the same species, like man, etc.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah,
Yeah.
that's the first point there. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Awesome. Well, Jack, anything, obviously I'm going to point people towards the paper because there's a lot more there in terms of detail and you have other objections, but are there any other just like final summary or conclusion thoughts that you have for us?
Yeah, I would say definitely think about my all three of my objections, and then the sort of development I've articulated here with objection three. But if you look at objection one, that might be one that pops up in the analytical treatment a lot, where I treat. It seems like my argument might try to add causal dispositions to essences, and that would be adding a causal disposition to something that doesn't exist. So the basic idea there is that, Aquinas seems to be committed to the point or the claim that essences they have a disposition to not exist in virtue of what they are, and so I address that in the paper, and I address it via two routes. So that should be something that's worth thinking about more. I don't
Hmm.
think that Aquinas is committed to that position.
No, I don't think so either.
Um,
Mhm.
yeah, but other than that, yeah, I think that like you said earlier, if once we start to understand Aquinas's actual metaphysics here and admit the real distinction, the inertialist position just falls away.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I know Schmid has tried to respond to to Gavin's paper and his book specifically, and I address some of Schmid's objections in the footnotes. I don't think that those work. So, yeah, I think that if you're a Thomist and you accept the real distinction, you don't really have much to worry about here.
Cool, man. All right, good news. Oh, Thomas, you can take a deep breath. It's funny because I kind of came the other way. Since I read kind of Adler first, I'm like, oh well, guess I'll, and that actually got me like heavily into like Leibnizian kind of arguments and PSR, which is great. Like that research was very fruitful, and I became convinced of at least some versions of PSR. I defend it in my book. But then as I got deeper into Aquinas, and especially the metaphysics of essence and esse, and then I went back and like, no, Adler's just wrong. There's no room for this in the Thomistic metaphysical system. Granted, it's like people always like to say, well, that's a controversial bit. Everything in philosophy is controversial. Like, welcome to philosophy. Right? It's all controversial, right? Some things might be more controversial than others, but everybody's metaphysical system is controversial. That's cool. Well, we like to be controversial. I think it's a good system, and I think it's absolutely right that once you have the system in place, there's just that it does depend on the real distinction, but the real distinction does the theoretical work you need to not be bothered by something like an inertial thesis. Spot on. Jack, how can people keep up with you? What are you working on next, and anything you want to leave the listeners with?
Yeah, I would say that you can go to my PhilPeople's page if you want to contact me. My CV's on there. You can get my email. I've got, we mentioned before the interview, I got a book review on Phaser's Immortal Souls coming out in the Review of Metaphysics, so that should be out by the end of the year. I've been toying around with some Mariology, interestingly enough.
Oh, cool, yeah.
So yeah, that's a whole different ball game. But yeah, I've just been working on Aquinas. I would say that if people want to dive deeper into this issue, a lot more work needs to be done. This paper that I wrote just scratched the surface, and it just gave you the bare bones of Aquinas's response. More work needs to be done on his arguments for the real distinction. And I think a dissertation or two, maybe even a book, need to be written on Aquinas's notion of the efficient cause and its Avicennian reception. He's really relying on a lot of key distinctions from Avicenna implicit in my argument, and that needs to be teased out a bit more. And then the final thing I would add is please take a look at Gilson's work. He's fallen on some hard times now, but his Being and Philosophers is a great place to start with Aquinas's theory of cognition, especially the appendices, and also his treatment of Aquinas in his Christian philosophy through the spirit of medieval philosophy is really good, because he mentions in Being and Philosophers in that book that you really can't understand Aquinas's metaphysics without understanding God's conservative action. And, I think we've tried to show that in this interview, how once you start to understand why Aquinas held that God conserves all things in being, you get into the real distinction, you get into the problem of the one and the many, you start to see how God can cause miracles, and you run from there.
Yeah. Well, Jack, it's been a delay. I think you've given us a lot of great stuff to think about, including some potential opportunities that are ripe for future research. So we'll commission the Legion here to go forth and do fruitful work, and hopefully we can have another chat on the podcast again. I would enjoy that very much, Jack. Thank you.
Good. Well, thank you for having me.